So I'm going to be boring and just read a bit of text because we have a manifesto of sorts here. Okay, guys, we're here to save the West. Well, we see that the politics and the political systems have failed or reached a dead end. But how does one save a moribund system from the grasp of an elite, of institutions, and to be frank, a significant part of the electorate that benefits from it? Since 2016, the very word for the change is the dread and promise that is populism. Is its promise a belief of our democracy is not just a finely tuned system and a machine that can and should be managed, but the ultimate expression of a sovereign people? The challenge is both national and supranational. For today, institutions are not only span countries, but engulf entire continents, and indeed the entire world. The whole of Europe and the whole of the West is intertwined in a myriad of ways, through academia, through the media, through law. Populism is often decried by its detractors as mere demagoguery, the dark art of fanning popular unrest, or the great unwashed masses to seize power for the sake of power alone. If we're to use populism, what is it we wish to conjure up? The election of Donald Trump as the People's Tribune in 2016, along with Brexit, started a trend of vast numbers of voters breaking away from traditional voting patterns to support radical change. Before any of this, however, populism was mostly referred to by a number of left-wing movements. SYRIZA in Greece, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela come to mind. Are we here coming up against the limitations of this word? Is populism a guiding principle or a political method? The idea of popular uprisings have always been a double-edged sword. The promise of liberation, symbolized in 1989 by the great German slogan, Wir sind das Volk, but also seen in violent passions of mob rule and the corruption historically following its wake. Are we to condemn Caesar for crossing the Rubicon? Or to condemn that arch-populist Pompey for forcing Caesar to do so while backing a corrupt system? This is a timeless question, one that shakes the very foundations of the Western world as we speak. There has never been a more apt time to answer them. And I think we have the perfect crew to try and do that. We have Johan Gjerdebo, my partner and co-host, Alexander Bard, philosopher extraordinaire, Ralph, the great Central European anchor, and of course, Mr. Benedict Beckeld, who holds down the American front for us. Welcome, guys. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
As we said, I couldn't think of a more perfect time to discuss populism.
And why is that, Carl?
Well, 3 great elections. President of America almost killed. I think the Caesar analogies here can be many because we have machinations in the American Senate. We have the fate of Donald Trump almost becoming a modern-day Caesar after crossing a few Rubicons. But I think we want to just maybe go back. First thing we do and just talk about this word populism. Maybe have a round discussion about what does the word mean? Is it the method? Is it the end? Is it the scare tactic that powers that be use against the people who want change? What do you think, guys?
Should we just start by saying that this is late July 2024, and we're in between Donald Trump having been shot, and I'm glad you called him president of the United States. He's the former president, Carl. We agree he's the president of the United States. But anyway, he's shot, and Biden has not resigned yet. So right. Obama's apparently talking to Biden right now, but it's time to give in. It's just like, so we're somewhere in between those two things right now. And we had the UK election and we had the French election and the European elections right before this. So that's where we're located. So we're speculating from that starting point. So I just wanted to say that because we live in such intense times right now. So even if the topic for today's conversation is populism, which is more relevant than ever, considering what's going on at the moment, it could be nice to just frame where this discussion is actually taking.
Indeed, fair point. And as you mentioned, Alexander, and the historical background, well, the contemporary historical background that you just gave suggests that there are more things ahead of us in store, even perhaps by the time we air this. But to ground our feet in what is otherwise a quicksand landscape, the term populism? What are we to make of it before we embark on these specific events and what they mean?
I can just start by saying I don't think we can use populism without using the word democracy at the same time. So you can just go back, say, 200 years ago, and everybody was threatened by democracy because if people would speak their mind, that'd be a threat. And it's just that the word populism is used as the new pejorative term instead to replace exactly how the word democracy was used, whereas everybody claims to be Democrat. Even North Korea calls itself a democracy. So democracy, which is the rule by the people, is then claimed to be this. And then populism, which means exactly the same thing. It means the people, the voice of the people are heard, and the people decide. It's just the same thing. So I would suggest the two words are, historically speaking, synonymous, but they're used in two totally different ways. And I would then propose that the way the word populism is used today is precisely the same way the word democracy was used by anti-democrats 200 years ago. It's just that the internet has arrived. Anybody can speak their mind. People go online all the time. And suddenly we're just flooded with opinions. And this was unprepared for the elites. And that's exactly why the word populism has to turn up the connotation it has today.
Is it technically enabled or taking on a qualitative difference because of the changes in the media?
Well, I can give you a perfect example to start from, Argentina. So finally, the Peronists have been overthrown. Peronism was always proudly populist. It wasn't never leftist or rightist or whatever. It was just populist. It's like, give the people what they want, promise them anything they want to hear. Don't hold any of the promises, ruin the country. And the most fantastic country in the world, it should be the wealthiest country on the planet, Argentina, has been ruined by this kind of populism for the past 40, 50 years, right? And then suddenly Javier Milei comes along, and the entire world accuses the liberal nationalists of being a populist, which is completely ironic. So we have two populisms here, which is a good starting point, because Argentina obviously is more populist than ever, since the way to fight populism was to invent a new type of populism. So that could be a good starting point for the conversation.
Maybe going back to the ancients is also a good source for this. We just referenced the fall of the Roman Republic, and Caesar obviously was the represented sort of the faction of the populares, which was the non-equestrian, non-noble blooded part of the Roman society, not the elites, so to speak, not the land-owning elites. This, obviously Caesarism has sort of become the thing of itself, but by the time he arrived on the scene, this was a proud tradition that had sort of existed for, I think, 100 years before it. You had people like Crassus, you had the Sulla versus Marius debate, or infighting rather, that destabilized the Republic. And I think this is a proto sort of term, because everyone is, even I think every democratic sort of politician that's harkened back to this has always tried to emulate this sort of struggle, in a sense, right? The fighting for the people instead of sort of the entrenched elites. And the sort of bloody end of that, with Caesar himself, it's sort of the double-edged sword, and always sort of the connotation where when people speak ill of populists is because of this sort of Caesarian connection, I think. So I think it's important to have that in mind.
I think those are good points, but I would probably diverge a little bit from the analogy with Rome that I usually find very helpful. But if we take the last couple of weeks and the elections we saw, I get a very strong 19th century vibe at the moment. If you look at like attempted assassinations in the United States, but of course you had the same in Slovakia as well. You have political systems that no longer fully seem to represent the people. Take the UK, right? You have Nigel Farage's reform gets 14% of the vote, and they get 4 seats. The Lib Dems get 12%, they get 72 seats. Labour gets 33%, and they get what? I don't know the exact number, like 273 or something. They get the required seats to form a government. So that's very odd. You have France, right? By the popular vote, Marine Le Pen's party becomes the strongest party, but by delegates, they're only number 3. So there was no scheming. These are the electoral systems as they are. But I think the same was true in the 19th century, right? You had kind of these established political systems, but they no longer fully reflect what is going on. And then you look at something, just as a comparison, then you have a system like in Hungary, well, more or less the popular vote adds up then with the actual representation of a party in government or a party in parliament. But supposedly it is Hungary that is they like to call themselves illiberal or post-liberal, whatever you want to call it, but quasi-authoritarian, and where elections or the popular will is not respected. So there's this kind of disconnect also between elite opinion and popular opinion, because I think this is also something we often talk about when we talk about populism, that it's not just populism because it's populism because it's popular, and it's not reflected in mainstream media narratives. Let's put it this way, even though I hate the term narratives, but I think in this case it is helpful. And I think there's another phenomenon. I mean, I really dove into many of Benedict's writings over the last couple of weeks and months, and I at least on occasion reference them, both in my work and also on my social media, because I think this remains one of the underlying phenomena. Because what also I believe distinguishes the populists from the non-populists is the distinction between oikophobia and oikophilia. Right? We can say, fine, this might be a little bit because the five of us are very intellectual, also that might be a very intellectual term, but I think it describes it nicely. But if we want, we could break it down also in a more populist representation and say between those who are patriotic and those who are, I would not say necessarily anti-patriotic, but I think that they consider themselves to be post-patriotic. And this is the thing, right? This is kind of when we talk about, I don't like the term so much because it has all these sometimes also somewhat anti-Semitic connotations, but this idea of globalists. I think it's not that they necessarily love the globe more than their country or that they are part of some great scheme or conspiracy, but it's just they are beyond all this. I think I said this last time we talked, but for me, the perfect embodiment was, I think back then he was a professor at Harvard. Currently he's in Vienna as the head of the CEU. But for a while, he was considering entering into Canadian politics, and there was Michael Ignatieff. And I remember he was interviewed by a Canadian newspaper, and they basically asked him, okay, you want to become Prime Minister of Canada, so what do you bring to the Canadian people? What's your connection to Canada? Right? Well, what do you love most about Canada? And his answer was, and I'm quoting, his answer was, I consider Canada a place, if I would ever need one, I would call home. And I think that kind of embodies this kind of post-patriotic sentiment. So it's not that he was oikophobic and said, oh my God, Canada, that he was kind of negatively inclined towards patriotism, but he was beyond all this. And I think the same was, for example, true with Barack Obama. Barack Obama was not an anti-American president. He was a post-American president, right? Stars and stripes and all of this, this is so yesteryear. Like we no longer do this. That the famous the clingers, God, guns, and religion. So I think this is one of the important markers, I guess, of contemporary populism, and that there is this divide between, again, another term I use carefully, between the elites and the non-elites. And the last point, because I'm sure we're going to come to this as well, which I'm curious to hear you guys' opinion on, particular, Benedict, you are in the United States and you guys are in the Nordic countries. What we have seen so far at the Republican National Convention, and also when we look at J.D. Vance, honestly, for lack of a better comparison, for me, the new Republican Party sounds like the German Social Democrats circa 1897.
100%. Sorry,
like
100%. Okay.
All right. Go on.
No. So I agree, and I think this comes back to your point also, Ralph, that it's sort of like the late 1800s where you have sort of the previous political language has broken down, and for lack of a better word, the most viable option is like Russian nihilists who are as careless about their own life as that of others. This kind of, if you want to be generous about it, an experimentation where things are going, but also that you have different political stripes that or political actors of different stripes that then try to pick up essentially similar reforms like pensions, some kind of support for destitute people in industrial areas, and they're sort of fighting for as of yet non-existent middle ground and making up as they go, keep in a way going in lockstep with their opponents. But the interesting thing is exactly your point, that there seems to be, for the first time, at least in a very long time, that the US now has, for lack of a better word, social democracy. Be that integralist or having other connotations and paradoxes, but it is there. As a Swede, as a Nordic, I absolutely agree with your analysis that in terms of associations, all the aesthetics are there. But also, I mean, you can also look at the track record of someone like Vance in Congress. I mean, they're protectionist, but also the reasons for why they're protectionist. Like when he said in his inauguration speech, maybe we can't call inauguration, but if we would say that President Trump is already elected, I guess we can say that Vance is already vice president. That you would represent workers, unionized and non-unionized, and this kind of class peace approach to politics, which I think not long ago would have been seen as sentimental at best or illoyal in the worst case for the Republican Party. But sorry, I interrupted you. But yes, I agree.
So I would love to hear Benedict come in here. And if J.D. Vance is now being accused of being even more populist than Donald Trump, he's accused of being more Trump than Trump. Obviously, a very good choice for Donald Trump in that case, if that would be true. But what about J.D. Vance? And obviously, he's taking a lot of the energy from him comes from the fact that he knows that his opponents are ecophobic.
Yeah. So I should have learned a lesson from the last time we did this by jumping in a little more often, because by the time I actually start speaking, there's so much I want to talk about already based on what's been said that I don't, like, at least this time I'm taking some notes. So, but anyway, so I guess maybe we'll come back to the term populism itself. I wanted to say a little bit about that as well. But so to pick up right to where you left off, Alexander, when it comes to J.D. Vance, yes. So I would make the point before I actually say what I think of his, and I agree. I don't like what he said very much in his speech. I will just make the initial point that the Republican National Convention and our party national conventions in general, they're not really meant these days, at least for policy as much as they used to be. They're meant more for as campaign rallies to get people to show up and vote. That's why, I mean, J.D. Vance's speech was not the only one that goes against a lot of standard Republican philosophy. Now, there is, of course, a change going on ideologically in the Republican Party, but I mean, you had the Teamster speak the other day, and I mean, that was pure socialism what he was talking about, and they allowed him to. They had him on because they want the labor unions, they want everybody to come out and vote. And then how they'll actually govern is something else. And then a lot of the Trumpian Republicans here now, the new guard, so to speak. And I mean, I'm partly a part of that, I suppose. I mean, I'm certainly going to vote for Trump. No surprise there. But the thing is, the way Trump governed in his first term was not what J.D. Vance was talking about, economically speaking. Trump cut regulations. He actually governed in a rather free market way. The difference, and this is a distinction that J.D. Vance didn't make, is that was with the tariffs, right? We can be in favor of tariffs, and a lot of us here are. I mean, I'm very much in favor of free markets, but I would be in favor of protectionism to the extent that it hurts China. And a lot of us have this attitude here. We're willing to be economically hurt if we know that it hurts China more. That's a price we're willing to pay. But what J.D. Vance was talking about wasn't hurting China. He was talking about protectionism as a goal in and of itself, as if that were going to improve the lot of the hillbillies, the part of the country where he comes from. And that's just nonsense. It's not. But in fairness to him, I do think to some extent it's a question of just getting people to show up. Whether Trump will actually govern that way is questionable, because that's not how he governed in the first term. But it is populist, of course, in that sense. And that's maybe where I would also come back a little bit to the term populism itself. We spoke about populism and its relationship to democracy and so on. I would say historically, most of the time, that populism it has that democratic element, but I would still consider it more a method than a question of philosophical content, because the populists, of course, once they actually achieve what they want and once they have acceded to power, they're not always going to be democratic. So, I mean, if we go back to Caesar, okay, he was a populist, but he made Rome less democratic. Not that it was all that democratic before, it was more oligarchical, but the oligarchy had at least a Republican element to it, whereas obviously the Principate then under Caesar didn't have it at all. So that's one additional point I would make. And in that regard, we might also want to draw a distinction between democracy and liberal democracy. So if what the people want is something that does not resemble a liberal democracy, that is still democratic to a certain extent. But maybe the people want to be ruled by a strong leader. maybe the people want someone to make decisions for it. And if so, we can say, okay, well, that's democratic in a sense. It's certainly populist, but it's not liberal democratic. And so I would also maybe introduce that distinction into the conversation as well by saying that nowadays when people criticize populists for being anti-democratic, it's not necessarily that they're anti-democratic, but some of them might be anti-liberal democratic, which is a distinction worth making, I think, as well. But anyway, that's, so far what I would say.
But isn't there something special about the situation where a 5-year-old can walk up to a television set and see Biden making a prick of himself together with Trump and just look at the man and say, but he's demented, and a 5-year-old can get it, and the entire world gets it. And the only person who doesn't get it is Joe Biden.
Right.
And he's surrounded by these yesers. I mean, this is mad. The reason why populism in any form like J.D. Vance grows exponentially at this time is because liberal democracy does not exist. There is no liberal democracy there. We have the Clinton, Biden, Obama clan who've ruled America, or at least ruled the Democratic Party for the past 30, 40 years, and nobody gets through. And we all know that the only person in the world who can sit down with Biden and talk him into giving in and allowing Kamala to run or whatever is Barack Obama. Nobody else will be able to do it. This is so hysterical. This is so weird that a 5-year-old would just think of the grown-ups doing this, like, but this is mad. So there is not even a liberal democracy there to begin with. It's just a completely corrupt system for the vast majority of people. And in that case, that fosters the populism. And this is like the old Persian idea of the social. It's like in the midst of chaos, a strong leader steps forward, and that's the only alternative we have. So,
how is that not liberal democracy? I mean, I agree with you with the populist idea that, okay, a 5-year-old can see this, and because of all of the media we have these days, it's much easier for the people to see these things than it used to be when the so-called elite had a...
We have an old establishment of television stations like CNN. We have the academia like Harvard, and we have the old political system that calls itself liberal democracy. They're all now confronted with the internet.
By liberal, so I should say by liberal democracy, I mean something like that espouses liberal ideas and, quote unquote, liberal ideas, as opposed to a democracy. It simply reflects the will of the people. Which
the liberal democracy that ultimately can't get rid of a demented man who refuses to resign. This is patricide on a large scale. This is patricide historically, and patricide has to be done. And I would say the system that allowed Biden to sit there still allows him tonight to sit there and say he's going to run. That system is so dysfunctional that it doesn't make any sense to call liberal democracy the way we used to.
Well,
it's just clan rule. It's just.
I mean, I don't disagree with you. I would only say that the thing is, I mean, okay, so people saw what happened at the debate, but I mean, anyone who pays attention to politics has been able to see that he's been demented for a long time. I mean, like you correctly said, a 5-year-old could see this, and yet Democratic primary voters still voted for him. And I mean, Biden says with some justification, I mean, obviously nobody despises Biden more than I do. I'll say that first of all, but he does say with some justification that, well, the people did vote for me in the primaries. They did. And
but
now,
they voted for him as non-Trump. They didn't vote for Biden. They voted for non-Trump.
Right.
And
Okay.
They thought he could win. And they thought he could win. And suddenly Nancy Pelosi and all the other guys realized it's going to be a Trump landslide in November.
But I wouldn't
unless somebody stops it.
I wouldn't say
that's just a clan defending its position using all the institutions. It's a Versailles. It's Versailles 1789.
But that's you saying
terrified of the streets of Paris. Right? And that's the streets of Paris are Trump and Bench.
Right, but that's just saying that the people are stupid. They made that decision, but I wouldn't say that that's anti-liberal democratic. I think there is this sort of attitude that, okay, well, if the people really gets to have a say, if we have a proper liberal democracy, then things will turn out all right. But I mean, I'm not saying that's exactly what you're saying. Right, but I'm saying...
I'm not talking about the definition. I'm talking about how this is being perceived by the world, by anyone.
Right, but you're saying it's not liberal democracy, but I'm saying the fact that the people make a stupid decision doesn't mean it's not liberal democracy.
Okay, I'm not going to...
Let's leave it at that.
I'm not going to interrupt Ralph.
I'm talking about where the motor of populism comes from.
Yeah.
Sure. And why we have populism versus populism, because the only thing left when the internet's taken over the world and old media is dying, academia is dying, all the institutions are dying, all we got left at that case is populism. We're bound to it. And when we're talking about these conversations is NatCon and LibNat. And what we didn't like about G.D. Vance's speech is obviously because he went nat con and we probably live nuts. So that's all there's to it. That's what I would say. So let's see what comes out of it. But this will affect all the major institutions if the institutions themselves will survive. Elon Musk has now thrown $45 million onto the Trump campaign per week. And Peter Thiel went down to Mar-a-Lago and sat down with Trump and convinced him to pick Vance. So obviously, this is the autocracy now taking over. Musk and Thiel are at the forefront of this.
All of these are points we need to get back to. But Ralph, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, just real quick. I think we also have to try. This is always the trickiest thing, and because we all, we always live in the moment. So I think it's so difficult then to separate the signal from the noise. What are the things that everything seems so overwhelming at the moment? And I think the difficult thing is to identify what will be trends that will stick with us, even when Trump, Vance, Harris, Biden, when they're all gone. And I think that I agree completely with Benedict that these conventions are not policy platforms. I think that's absolutely correct. But I do still believe they give us a glimpse of the direction or the self-perception of the party. And I think you're absolutely right. I think economically, what J.D. Vance said, I don't kind of want to focus too much on him, but I think it's so interesting. I completely agree again with Benedict. This was not a speech about, let's say, a pro-market, pro-free market, pro-capitalist politician. I mean, he even used the term Wall Street barons ruined the economy. I mean, I don't saw a big difference between J.D. Vance in the realm of economics and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, to be quite honest. Yep. Then if you go a step further, if you look at the convention, and I don't want to stick everything at the convention, so these are just a few things, and we'll see if these are trends that will remain. They tried to be, and personally, I'm not sure if I think this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm on the fence about this. But they tried to be a big tent, right? They had the Amber Rose, or whether it was we basically, what everyone thinks about this, an OnlyFans model, right? Something that would have been complete anathema for social conservatives a year ago. And you had members of the kind of traditional social conservative movement who said this was the convention where social conservatism died. So it's what kind of, I guess it's also, so if there was the connection between, let's say, populism, right wing, and conservatism, I'm curious to hear you guys' opinion on, okay, but what's going to remain of genuine, and we also probably have to define this a little bit, but what remains of genuine conservatism? Because I always found this so remarkable about Trump, if we kind of want to talk about him just a little bit more. Whatever Trump was, he was not a radical conservative. I found this always odd. Like this man, if you look at his biography, is many things. But if you say, draw a generic social conservative, show me the individual, I would say, Trump, that's the guy. Like, I mean, this is the guy of multiple divorces, multiple affairs, may or may have not slept with almost several Playboy playmates and porn stars, was pro-gay marriage before Joe Biden and Barack Obama were pro-gay marriage, was a guest of honor at Chelsea Clinton's wedding. So this is not where you say, yes, this is the staunch social conservative. So that this was always, I think, a misrepresentation by the media. So what is going to be, and I'm to be very clear, it might sound like I have a problem with this. I don't. I'm not sure. This is why I always refer back to Benedict's oikophobia and oikophilia, because that's for me the dividing line. That has always, and I think this has, at least subconsciously for some, also for the social conservatives, always been a dividing line. If the gay movement 50 years ago would have come out and say, we are gay and we are nationalists, basically the entire conservative movement would have said, man, those gay guys, we can work with them. And I think this has always been the dividing line that things are projected into. I mean, you see the same now at universities and with the quote-unquote elites. The biggest problem I have, and I think we saw this also in Europe, is when you have protests at university campuses and they burn American or German or Swedish flags and wave Palestinian flags, because this kind of tells me these people don't have loyalty to the same country, community values that I have. But if they would, I probably would not care about their positions that much. Not all of these can be connected, but I think this is a little bit what the Trump Republicans are now doing. They are no longer a social conservative party. And they're also becoming now, apart from being anti-woke populists, they are becoming anti-capitalist populists. And this is where I'm fully with Benedict. On the long run, I'm not sure if this is a good sign. So I fully agree. And the last point on this, I didn't like regarding to the economy what J.D. Vance was saying. And by the way, this is also not what he was saying in his book 8 years ago. Like this was not his like, this is a new position that he's taking. So I'm a little bit afraid I might be proven wrong here. I mean, I don't think that the race is over. There is a chance that when we meet the next time, the candidate is no longer going to be Biden. I guess we'll know on Monday or Tuesday, but it's going to be somebody maybe like the current governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. And these are people, I think, who have a valid chance against Donald Trump. Honestly, if they take somebody like Josh Shapiro, I think he will win. I don't think that Donald Trump would have a chance against him. But let's assume, hypothetically for a second, that Trump is going to win and that somebody like J.D. Vance will play a significant role in the government. Vance is very smart. But my fear is that he's also smart in a way that he knows what he has to say to get further, to advance whatever it is that he plans to advance. And some people say he's ideologically pragmatic. That's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it could, of course, also be that he sees where the winds that the winds are shifting, that you no longer can do the free market, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of thing is working. So he now sounds, as I said before, he sounds like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. That might not be a bad thing, but it's an interesting shift. So the idea that under Trump the Republicans move to the right, I just think there is no evidence on this. The only thing what they are right doing is maybe anti-woke and transgenderism. And the border and immigration. Those are the things where they're actually right. But I feel that in all other areas, they have actually moved to the left or towards liberalism, if you want.
I disagree on one point, though, and probably the most important one, and that's the budget. So,
in what sense?
Trump lowered taxes the last time. Yeah. And for all economists, it's been deeply problematic with Trump versus Biden simply because they're both ruining America at the moment. America now has the biggest government deficit in the world after Italy, per capita. And it's growing exponentially. It's exploding. So America is just borrowing money like mad and spending it like crazy. And the problem is Biden spends money he doesn't have, whereas Trump is lowering taxes that can't be lowered. So he's definitely on the right when it comes to that, because actually, if you ask the average people today what is left and what is right, the first thing they say to leftists want a big government and they want tons of money and they want redistribution, as they call it, which just means more bureaucracy. We all know that. Whereas the right is usually fighting for lower taxes, at least on the liberal side of the black, it's liberal nationalism. And in that case, actually, Trump is still the game, not Vance. Vance, they're trying out to see where he's going to end up. And he's changed his opinion on many things already to get to become vice president. And at the end of the day, I think Vance will tell you what Peter Thiel tells him what to do, to be honest about it. I think that's the game. So I would say go with Trump. I mean, Trump will definitely lower taxes. He will not, and he will make the American budget deficit bigger than ever. That's where America's going.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where he's a rightist. That's where he's a right.
So I think there are two. I mean, there's one sort of American strand of populism and one European strand, but I think they can be split up in two sort of sectors. I think you can point to people who are economically populist, and I think you can turn to people who are like traditionalist populist in the sense of I think in England, for instance, I mean Farage is anything but like a economic populist. He's a classic Thatcherite, Reaganite, right winger, I'd say. Like France, you obviously have the mega version of what the nightmare of the Chamber of Commerce in a sort of Vancian universe would be Le Pen doctrine of massive subsidizing and high pensions and this sort of game. I think it's interesting because I think those two are the main drivers. You have sort of the immigration game has been number one, I think, in Europe for driving this. And sort of economics have been lagging a bit, but catching up would be my sort of instinct and my sort of look at this. And I would be very interested because I think people can sort of understand Le Pen, and I think people can understand UKIP. But I want to ask Ralph about the AfD and maybe also the FPÖ, which has been sort of the specter haunting Europe for a long time, the sort of Austrian right wing, and how that sort of fits into the whole scheme. Is there a sort of populist version of Austrian politics, and also your take on the AfD?
I can answer this very, very, very quickly. The Austrian, the Freedom Party is exactly unifying what we were just saying, right? They are a right-wing party in many respects, except the economy. Right? They don't talk about free market. They did, again, when Austrian populism started, those of you old enough to remember, with Jörg Haider in the early 90s. Right? That was, I would argue, kind of a Nigel Farage right-wing, anti-immigration, always a little bit playing around with, the historical past of Austria, going to veterans meetings of the SS and shenanigans like this, but economically liberal, but socially conservative. But that's no longer there. They're still socially conservative, but they also have become, let's call it, economically illiberal in a sense. Kind of they push also more to kind of a state control socialist direction. And we see the same thing. I'm glad you bring up Germany. Germany is a beautiful example for this. So you have the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, right? The Alternative for Germany, very right-wing party. Economically, until recently, very liberal. So let's see what happens in Germany. So because they left that flank open, kind of or let's call it the basic inclination of also the Germans to be more socialist than free market oriented, you have now a new party, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is basically precisely like the AfD, except that they are very, very much to the left on economic issues. The Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht would never have come into existence if the AfD would not be a free market party. I mean, they're shifting this now too, because unfortunately, I'm not saying, I guess it's also maybe a communication problem, but at the moment, people like the whole anti-immigration rhetoric. They like the cultural conservatism, but they don't like free market stuff. It might be slightly different in the UK. I think Nigel Farage is the big exception here, because I think the British still have generally a positive view of capitalism at the free market. I don't think there might be, maybe Switzerland, so again, maybe some parts in the Nordic countries. I think there are some exceptions to this, so I don't want to completely generalize. But overall, the dedication and support for pure free market economies, or as Alexander correctly pointed out, or massive indebtedness. I mean, basically the entire West is drowning in a sea of debt. But this is something that people simply ignored. You guys corrected. I'm very glad you did. You also mentioned Jean-Marie, that's her father. Of course, you mentioned Marine Le Pen. I mean, her economic program would kill France. I mean, let's be honest, again, I like her in immigration, I like her in culture, but the idea that you can not just not increase, but lower the French retirement age. I mean, these are economic insanities. You can't finance any of that. And I think this is a problem that we have to deal with, because personally, again, I'm I guess a social market liberal, or whatever you want to call it. So I believe that there should be kind of the ordering hand of the state, right? Nobody wants kind of Wild West capitalism, a rerun of Manchester capitalism. But I think the idea that even right-wing parties have, that the perfect life situation is you go to university until you're 25, then you work until you're 60, and then you're retired until you're 90 on 90% of your last salary. I mean, that's just not going to work. And the last point to this, because I think it's also important. Now, even if you support this, then you would have to say, okay, if we do this, we need productivity gains, let's say with automation, with robotics. But they're against this as well, because I believe that, for example, somebody like Tucker Carlson will play a role as not as a mastermind, but his views, I think, would hypothetically influence a new Trump administration. And he openly said, right, he would ban, for example, automated driving, because that would increase the unemployment rate when it comes to truckers. Now, I get the point, right? I see, again, this is this kind of economic populism. You can do this, but this is like saying we ban cars because we are really, really worried that all these horses that drag the carriages will be out of work. You can do this, but not everybody will sign up to it. So then when everybody has these automated drivers and you're the only country who doesn't, you're going to lose also in the economic competition. So there is this also on the right, this kind of new hostility towards not just capitalism, but also towards technological progress, which I find is particularly important. I don't know how many of you read this, but for example, which is otherwise interesting, but in Compact Magazine, right? Sora Kamari's thing. I mean, they are basically, I'm not going to call them Luddites, but let's just say they're on the brink of it.
This is what happened in France. So we had the French election, and the stock market in Paris collapsed. when it was clear that we had Mélenchon on one side promising 90% tax rates for the rich, which is, of course, really popular, typical, a classic sort of bad populist policy, right? And on the other hand, there was Le Pen. And he said, it doesn't matter who now is going to influence the tiny little middle left with Macron, because Macron was pro-tech, like he aggressively pro-tech. Mistral is the only one major AI company in the world. It's the only major European AI company in the world that is French. So, and now all the French tech is just like, oh, we're going to leave? Are we going to move to London, or where are we going to go? So that's really interesting. That's a striking point. And I think the problem is this: if populism does have a problem, with any politics has a problem, it is the problem that as soon as a politician can convince you that he's stolen your money from you and hidden it, but he's giving the money back as a gift. As soon as a politician can promise you, gives you a gift, and you think the gift comes from out of nowhere, and you don't even see that it's stolen from you, then he wins, and you get big government, high taxes, and right now that seems to be the winning story just about everywhere. It's going to be the same in the UK too with Labour. So
can I just ask Benedict, because I think an interesting dynamic of this is it's sort of the old paradigm. We've been talking socialist versus like free market a long time, and I think like an interesting thing that's happened in the last 10 years, and I think Tucker Carlson is a great example of this. Vance is a great example of this, but framing sort of capital as anti-patriotic or oikophobic, if you have all these big corporations who are, driving the trans issue, driving woke issues, and these same people have been advancing sort of the argument of the anti-familyness of these companies, of a lot of capitalist capitalist practices in itself, and birth rates being a part of this sort of equation in a sense, right? That you either have sort of immigration or you have birth rate, and if that birth rate's coming from the current system, it doesn't seem to work. But what I want to ask you is, how do you square that sort of circle of how do you look at the sort of woke capital and the sort of seeming monolith of American capital being behind the Democratic Party and sort of the shift of the Republicans?
Well, I would say that, so first of all, I don't think that, I agree with what has been said, and I actually don't think describing people like Tucker Carlson, for example, I don't think that the word Luddite is too harsh. I think it's actually quite well deserved. Because, as you say, the example with the horse-drawn carriages and everything, I think it's quite apt. When it comes to seeing this in a cultural context, and it's Carl, in oikophobic context and so on, you mentioned a big part of American national pride isn't just wealth and military power and so on. It's based a lot on the idea of America as the land of innovation. And innovation would be one of the first things to suffer under such economic policies, clamping down on the free market and all of these things. So I think that is a part of, I'm not going to say that, obviously nobody's against innovation in the abstract, but advocating for policies that would make American innovation suffer is forgetting to a certain extent what is exceptional about the United States, at least what has traditionally been considered to be exceptional about the United States. So yeah, in that sense, the fact that the Republicans are now moving slowly in that direction, again, I still want to make that distinction between rhetoric and actual action. Well, I don't know to what extent, if Trump has had a change of heart or if he's just allowing Vance to say what he wants to say in order to attract more voters and so on, because again, based on his first term, that's not really how he governed. But I would still say that the fact that both parties are moving in that direction is certainly a sign of American decline, to be sure.
Carl, did you want to add your thoughts? I have some on that both Alex, Ralph, and Benedict brought up.
I just want to think. I would add the fact that I think the sort of culture is a thing that's very interesting in this sort of case, because I think, for instance, in Sweden, where I think the consensus is that the sort of economics that we have should be kept in place because we're an exporting country, and everyone sort of knows that we're not going to go down the Le Pen route. But I think what drives populism here is a sense of hatred against the elites, and the fact that that you can vote for less immigration for 20 years and nothing happens. And I think UK is probably right now, and the US as well, are the best examples of this. I mean, you have even liberal politicians in New York and along the Eastern Seaboard saying, no, please don't send anymore. And now the consensus all over Europe seems to be that less immigration. But I mean, it's one thing that politicians say this and sort of what the state enacts is another thing. And I think this is the problem also, that we have a state machinery, we have the sort of, bureaucratic state machineries in all these countries that are sort of, still running on the politics of 10 years ago. And the sort of people entrenched in these bureaucracies are sort of, trained under a system and they're sort of still here. They're like, the Japanese soldier in the jungle, like in the 70s, still fighting, World War II, when these people are still, driving, the liberal policies of the aughts in 2024. So I think this is a thing. I mean, when and if Trump comes to power, I think, whatever he thinks, he has to enact policies. And this, I think, is a driver of populism more than anything else, that the fact that whether you vote for anything, you still have to, deliver on certain policy issues. And politicians all over the West have been able to do so.
Okay,
I would add one more point.
Let me just add one little thing. I don't think you have to worry about America being the land of innovation at all. That's why I believe in America the next 50 years, Benedict, because Musk and Thiel and Andreessen and Horowitz are the 4 biggest sponsors of Vance and the Trump-Vance campaign. So don't worry about it. And certainly Shapiro, Whitmer coming around the corner, the Democrats are also totally pro-innovation. That is the American story. Europe is the place where we hate innovation and are terrified of it. And that's why Europe is in a much worse place than America over the next 50 years. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with what you said. I'm not comparing America with Europe in that regard. I think you're completely right. I'm comparing America, what it is, to what it could be, I suppose. And on that front, I wanted to make one point also that you reminded me of, Carl. When we talk about this kind of grievance politics that we see developing now on the American side, from a cultural point of view, another big problem with that is that the poor people, the quote unquote poor people, the people to whom J.D. Vance is speaking in a speech like that, it used to be that 20 years ago in the United States, those people would say wouldn't despise the elite and the Wall Street traders and so on the way they do, because they would say it's okay that those people are rich, because 10 years from now, I will be as well. Yep. And that used to be a very American attitude. And I mean, I've seen this difference from the 90s to today here in the United States. It's very palpable. You remember still in the 90s, even early 2000s, people had this attitude. It's okay that the rich are rich and that I'm not, because I'll be one of them soon enough. Now, there is this idea, of course, that, okay, where we were born, you see this now more on the Republican side. Like if I was born in the Rust Belt somewhere in Pennsylvania or whatever, that's where I am. That's my lot in life. And so now, of course, I need somebody like J.D. Vance to step in and help me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And on the left side, you have the woke sort of hierarchy of grievance, instead, replacing that and sort of trying to, find a way, power hierarchy from that sort of, identity itself. Yeah.
I'm thinking of Ralph's point earlier, that the importance of distinguishing between what is noise and signal here, which of course can always be said to be a commendable pursuit. But in this regard, I'm also thinking of what time frame we're looking at this. Not just, I mean, obviously we've spoken a lot about Vance and the US, and maybe I want to get back to your comment, Carl, about the two tails of populism, or the different branches or mechanisms driving European as opposed to American populism. But if the time frame we're looking at this is perhaps like centennial, like we have to really stretch this out. Alexander mentioned at least 50 years in terms of innovation. But one thing that I think can be stated at this point, again, coming back to Alexander's point, that this is what liberal democracy turned out to be, that liberal democracy is having its Soviet moment, that this is real existing liberal democracy. This is what it ended up being. And anyone who remains a sort of a classical liberal will start to sound like socialist. Oh, this is not genuine liberal democracy. Okay, fine. Well, you had your run. And now I think that is really what's encapsulated in terms like post-liberal. Not that term in of itself is satisfactory, but what I think would be interesting for us to grapple with here is coming back to the 19th century analogy or late 19th century, is that you have this distrust of free market actors, a rising protectionism. Sort of, you had the East India Company making an absolute mess of India, at which point England becomes like a reluctant active imperial power. Same in the US, a sort of power vacuum where you move in to take over in the Caribbean. So like rising protectionism and imperial struggle, essentially saying that World War I could have started maybe 10 or maybe even 20 years earlier, is what I'm suggesting. And then similarly, insurgent nationalism within previous empires. Sorry, Ralph, to the Habsburgians here. But I think what is interesting in this regard is there is a comparison, is a similarity, but also difference.
Is Trump Franz Ferdinand?
Of course. No, yeah.
In this analogy.
Almost. Oh, we'll see. Okay. But there's one major difference I would contend here, and to have your pushback on, is to the extent the West in this case is now China in this integration, that we are the ones receiving the opiates. We're the ones who are being disembobulated by foreign powers. And but the similarity would then perhaps be that there is then a realization, coming back to Alexander's point of liberal democracy no longer be viable, of a new political program. And I would posit that the gestalt we might think of as Trump and Vance is the kind of prototype for the Teddy Roosevelt analogy. That it's not by coincidence that they talk about Wall Street barons. That similarly, like Teddy Roosevelt would have an antitrust approach to railway tycoons and the swamp in his day and age, we have the antitrust approach to social media and the opiates that they have been creating. So I think it's too early to say, but more so than Caesar and Octavian, the actual interest here is how this is for the first time when some sort of new political platform can be established. And then maybe 10, 20 years down the road, you will have a sort of new FDR corporatist or New Deal program that is actually productive and vitalist, as opposed to the current one. I'm going to stop now, but I want to provoke us to stretch out the time frame of where this might be going, to get back and take seriously Ralph's comment of noise and signal.
Well, let me just try to identify a few things that I believe is signal and not noise. Like one, if we make the 19th century comparison, which I like a lot because I find the 19th century probably the most fascinating period in Western, if not human history. But of course, the 19th century governments had to manage ascendancy, and we have in many ways to manage decline. I think that's a massive difference. The reason why I'm very defensive of 19th century governments is they had growing populations, they had massive technological change, they had, urbanization. So the kind of things that these governments had to deal and manage, and the way they did it, I think is astounding. I think many other political systems would have entirely broken down. Now, there were moments when it was on the brink of breaking down, right? You had 1848, you had 1815, right? You had all these periods, but overall, the nations did survive. The countries did survive, right? You're right, the empires disintegrated after 1918, but overall, I think they had a fairly good run. But the problem, I think, that we're going to have in the West, and by the way, also in China, this is where I kind of slightly disagree with Alexander, is we are going to get too old to innovate at some point. I just think that, if you have in Austria, the average age is 43 years. I don't know, in America, it's slightly lower, and maybe they can manage if they remain the magnet for the world's talent to come to them. And then is again the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs that come from outside of America and then bring innovation and innovative talent to the United States. But I think this is going to be the big problem for Europe. There's this idea that you can escape the breakdown of social security of pension systems by increasing productivity through technological advances. And I think Benedict mentioned as well, who is going to bring those advances and innovations to Europe? There is no, I'm exaggerating slightly, but we are simply no longer competitive in this area. I think this is the biggest problem. So when we say, okay, what's going to be in 40, 50, 60 years, what's going to be kind of one of a culmination point, I think it's going to be the breakdown of healthcare and pension systems, because at some point, right, ends and you no longer can make ends meet, and then whatever then the populist or the population's reaction to this is. But at the moment, this is unavoidable. And again, whether it's Europe or the United States or even China, right, everybody is whistling past the graveyard. Like every government, authoritarian, because the Russians have the same problem, the Ukrainians have the same problem. So every government is just saying, no, not going to happen. It's true. Some magical thing is going to happen, and that will solve this problem. But at the same time, we come closer and closer to a situation where the average age of the population and the average age when people retire is coming closer and closer and closer together. Like, for example, the average age in France is something like 44 years old. Now they reduced the retirement age to 60. Well, at some point, you're going to have, the average French person is going to be 55 and the retirement age is going to be 56. So the idea that you can build a dynamic economy on this is completely absurd, because the young people will leave. This is always my thing also again in Austria. I said this idea to say to a talented guy from India or a talented girl from Brazil, come to Austria because there you, with your work, you can sustain 2 pensioners. Good luck with that. I don't think that many people will sign up for this.
Alex.
I agree totally with you, Ralph, on this one. So I would say the future belongs to India and America, simply because of demographics and also because of trends when it comes to innovation. And when I say India, I mean Indians. You go to Dubai, 80% of the population are Indians. Dubai is thriving. Singapore is thriving, full of Chinese people and Indians, right? So that's where it's all happening right now. And American companies are increasingly taken over by Indian immigrants. The average Indian immigrant family in America makes $1.5 billion. $150,000 per family, which is like 3 times more than the average American family. Already first-generation Indians make 3 times more than the average American family. So this is already now a big topic in American populism. How do we stop the flood of Indians moving in, taking over everything, like taking over Texas? And after the Indians, there's also the Nigerians and the Ghanaians coming. Now, the hope was that these guys could also move to Europe. And Europe could be on a par, for example, with Asia and America in this game. But with Labour taking over the UK, going towards a high-tax society right now, probably that was the only option we had in Europe to feel people feel welcome so Indians could move to Britain and start companies and be entrepreneurial. I think that window has been closed with the Labour victory in the UK. And I think right now Macron was the only one who saw this happening, and he's just devastated because he lost the election in France. Right now, Europe is going towards some kind of big government populism, big style. And any way you look, that's what's happening. And the big government populism is ironically considered anti-establishment. All of this becoming the new establishment very quickly. That was the European election. That was the election to the EU. So yeah, right now, there's nothing happening in Europe whatsoever. And nobody's addressing. Everybody's still talking about the climate in Europe. Climate is nothing compared to demographics.
Yeah.
Demographics is the big issue for the next 50 years. Climate is just so marginal compared to that.
And I think like a good sort of 1914 analogy that I don't want to make, but I think it's sort of apt, because I mean, Ralph stated, the Russians have this problem too with demographics. And I think that might even have been, we will probably never know, but that might have been a driver for the war, because, they have a window where sort of resources still maybe could be used. The problem with this obviously is, that the Chinese might be thinking just the same thing. They have, a sort of, a 10-year period before, the decline starts to kick in. Massively. It's really bad right now. But what will happen? As the problem with the First World War wasn't, Archduke Franz Ferdinand got shot, but the problem was, managing sort of rising empires, and the Germans. Case for launching the war was really the fact that they were outnumbered 3-1 by the Russians, and they needed a fast win against France to then push against the Russians. So we're sort of in the inverse scenario now, that Chinese might be thinking, it's now or never for Taiwan, and then sort of all bets are off, because then we're going to do, what we've been talking about, the sort of protectionist hellhole race to the bottom. It's going to happen by itself, because global trade is going to be shut down by such a war. So we're living in interesting and depressing times.
But I think, Carl, with regards to, I'll let you in soon, Ralph, but I think your comment, Carl, in a way ties back to the different outcomes of populism in the US vis-a-vis Europe. That is, America first will have, depending on what administration, you have different priorities for the managed decline of American empire. Like, do you go from Ukraine or from Israel or from Taiwan? But in Europe, I think the issue is rather that you have 130 million so Russians, I'm not going to say willing, but at least fighting a war. Whereas in Europe, you have like 450 million in the population with a slim chance of having anything similar to a military capacity. So
yeah, no, but I just don't think you can do that comparison. I think I don't think, you know, the sort of Russian threat isn't interesting in that sense of they have 130 million people willing to fight, which they don't have. I mean, if they can't even take the Ukraine, it says, I mean, a lot for them. But I think the problem here is more a case of the sort of political triggers, the trigger points of where states sort of has, you know, they manage risk until a certain point. And if I mean, the calculus from Putin seems to have been it's now or never to do this. And I mean, a Chinese government that's, I'd say, much more stable, much more calculating than Putin ever will be, might at some point, due to these sort of considerations, be thinking in the same lines vis-a-vis.
Sure. And my point is not whether or not Europe is able to defend itself externally in terms of war, but rather that one appeal of populism is coming back to ideas of leaders, is that you exert some sort of vitalism. This is not about innovation in Europe, is my point. Like Alexander's point that Europe is not going to be innovative. I mean, that is true, and that's going to have a host of other issues. But in terms of winning the populist vote, it's not about innovation or economy. They're basically building a base not on class in material terms, but class in cultural terms. And so that's more like, if you have 450 million people not able to defend their own society, coming back to discussions of oikophobia and oikophilia, I think that discussion is very much more, Europe is more in a fever pitch of who is the xenophone or the outsider, whereas in the US, it seems more to be the case of breakdown of the family. That is, you're fighting between siblings, which is not really the case in Europe. And I'm trying to get back to this point of taking it seriously. Again, your comment on the two tails of populism, that they operate to different, they set different targets, essentially.
Yeah, I think all of you are correct. I think also, Carl, I completely agree. I think what you're saying about the closing window, I think this is definitely something that plays into the thinking in Moscow and Beijing. But I also think that the world, or significant parts of the world, live in let's say a state of cognitive dissonance, right? And we do the same. We pursue policies as if we have 19th century demographics, which we don't. Again, if Putin really wants to maintain Russia as a civilization or a culture, his biggest problem is that apparently Russian men are incapable of impregnating Russian women, to put it bluntly. And the same problem, of course, by the way, also have in Ukraine. I mean, this is why, this is not a pro-Putin position, but honestly, every single Ukrainian soldier that dies diminishes the chances of having Ukrainians in the future, because they already had horrible demographics before the war broke out. So even if, again, let's say they maintain whatever territory they ultimately end up with, is, will they still have people to actually populate it? And the same is, of course, true also with China and Russia. What's the point of expanding territory if you have no one to live in that new territory? You must say whatever you want about the Germans, but at least the idea of Lebensraum, the idea that, as the Nazis said, we have people without space. So we have so many Germans, we just have to find places to move them to, that had, quote unquote, I mean it cynically, that had at least some internal logic to it. But if you have a population that is dying, if you have whole entire areas that are depopulating, and say, we need more land, for whom? And it's completely different. For whom do the Russians need more land? They need more people, right? Ideally, they would invite all the Slavic-speaking people in the world to come to Russia, to make sure that whichever rinky-dink village still exists outside of Moscow will still exist in 50 years.
Yeah, I agree with this one. So it's like, I'm going to go to Japan in October, and I just realized that I'm going to go there to sit and meditate, do Zen meditation.
Did you get the visa, Alexander, for
for Japan. I don't need a visa.
Yeah, the new visas for helping them demographically. That's been
Yeah.
That would be such a great,
I've been given a
development arc of Alexander Bard.
Yeah,
like the father of thousands.
Here's the thing. To go to Japan for me now is to go to Italy. I'm just go to a nostalgic postcard. I know nothing's going to be new. I know they're going to have fax machines at the hotel receptions. It's just going to be terrible. But compared to Russia and Ukraine are dirt poor and have horrible demographics. It's at the bottom of the pit. It's the worst place in the world. It's either Russia or Ukraine. Demographics are absolutely horrible, and they're also dirt poor. At least in Japan and Italy, you have still some money left, unless the government's completely overspent, because they're the two most indebted countries in the world when it comes to governments, Japan and Italy. And of course, they're vulnerable people and everybody's dying. If I want to see something new and get inspired, I have to go to Dubai or San Francisco. That's just the case. It's just where everything is thriving. It's those places, and it's not anywhere in Europe, because Europe is turning itself into postcard. Even if Vienna is the most livable city in the world, that's according to a standard made by 65-year-olds, according to what 65-year-olds think. Vienna is fantastic, but it's a fucking postcard. It's not the future. The future is really somewhere else. And right now, it's like I said, even before the gay guys and the artist movement still wear, which is usually inspiring because that's when gentrification starts, look where the architects are going. Like Saadi says, I'm an architect. I build for dictators because they don't interfere with my architecture. So, where are they building right now? They finished building in China. Where are they building now? India and the Middle East. And the occasional building in Texas right now. It's Austin and places like that. Australia, New Zealand, and tons of money thrown into new private skyscrapers right now in India and the Middle East. That's where it's happening, not anywhere else. And do you know, by the way, the two countries in the Western world that actually have higher birth rates than required to have population growth? And those two countries are Israel and Palestine.
Wait, both?
Yeah. Israel is 3.7 children per woman, and Palestine is actually 4.5.
Well,
I guess they're bored in Gaza, so they just breed.
Yeah, Benedict was about to revoke the nation status of one of those countries, but
well, and more the Western status of anything. But
yeah, yeah. Well, then again, yeah.
I said two nations, didn't say nation state. Need to be
coming back to populism. Sorry, just give me a shit. Yes, Thiel. I actually think this is interesting, Alexander, what you brought up earlier with the election of Vance. Not just the fact that he comes out of the Thiel Foundation and those collaborations, and might very well be, if not directly implementing his policies, then at least susceptible to the advice. Let's put it like that. But I think it's a larger landslide also in terms of changing the normie voters' view of what the Trump presidency or administration is, in the sense that, and perhaps this might sound like a too parochial term, but when we had Curtis Yarvin on in the podcast, his remark regarding the Sweden Democrats, that would be the national populists in Sweden, is that their main sin is not being xenophobic, but that they're peasants. That is essentially, they cannot be trusted with power. And if there's one thing that plagued the Trump administration was a lack of talent. And no, of course, we can say that someone who has a Harvard degree these days is not necessarily the same thing, because you have the print paper analogy to print money now in higher education. But you see what I'm getting at. Like there's a credentialism, and you have a larger pool of people to draw upon, whereas the Trump administration had to draw upon families and their extended networks. Now, with the proximity to the Thiel sphere and Silicon Valley, it's not just the money, but a new access to human capital. You're solving essentially the problem by how you stack the entire administration. So whereas the progressives have people with university degrees, then now the MAGA movement has dropouts who have proven themselves in the field of battle, which is innovation and entrepreneurship. So this also, in a way, clears up some of the issues with regards to the qualifications. That, okay, they might sound like populists, but that they're competent and so on. But then the question is whether or not we should describe this as populist, or if the outcome is actually going to be, if you excuse my Marxist synthetic tendency, techno-populism.
Well, that's clear. That's clear where it's going. So obviously, the PayPal mafia are not going to spend $100 million a week on the Trump Vance campaign unless they believe they have a major say in what they're going to do. So I think take the populism where it's heading, because then these guys have figured out that libertarian policies will never be popular and can never win elections. So all you can do is that you can make sure that you can have libertarian policy implement exactly what you need them, which is within entrepreneurship. So you can go on being innovative. And nobody in America will disagree with that. I mean, what comes after, finally, when Biden, Obama, that shit's over the Democratic Party, they're going to have stars like Whitmer and Shapiro, and they're stars, right? And they're going to be totally pro-innovation too. So America will be fine in years. It's just right now that it's increasingly, it's hysterical right now, but it certainly looks fine over, say, 5 to 10 years' time. No problem at all. But I think techno populism, in this sense, is the response to the fact that everything right now is people are pressing the button anti-establishment. Donald Trump's unique talent was to portray himself as anti-establishment, win the election, sit in the White House for 4 years with the biggest TV show on earth, Nancy Pelosi's the evil witch, get out of the White House and come back as anti-establishment again. Right? If you manage to do that, you win elections. Right now, you do win elections that way. Sweden is probably the only exception, because Swedes, I don't know what, they're so fucking stuck in bad demographics. They don't even do that. But for the rest of the world right now, just to be anti-establishment is you're populist and popular and you win elections. So that's exactly they can swing officially from right to left, like it just did in the UK with the Labour victory, because Labour came along as anti-establishment, because people just want to get rid of Sunak and the other guys and get them out of the way, and they probably go the other way in 4 years' time. So it switches back and forth and back and forth. And whoever gets their old establishment, the eggs are thrown at you and out you go. So that in that sense, we live in a very populist stage, I would say. And I think the tech guys have figured this out, and therefore they're lining themselves with whatever is populist right now, because they can always switch sides in 4 years' time, and they get their way. They want to get their way in America, and they will.
I share your optimism in a sense, Alexander, but I think there's going to be a struggle against the old guard and the sort of I mean, say what you will of the term deep state, but against the managers, if you will, of the sort of state machinery. I think there's going to be a struggle, as there will be a struggle, as there is a struggle, like in countries like Sweden, for enacting, even building a nuclear power plant is virtually, it can't be done because of the managers, not because of unwilling politicians. So I think a lot of the sort of quest for some sort of realignment is to find a way to retool, so to speak, the state machinery for a more sort of agile functioning and a more compatible to the voting patterns of the public. I just hope it can be done, because I still see it. I think we sort of I think we will sort of miss a lot of times is there are still a lot of people with entrenched sort of interests in the current status quo that I think we all hate. And I think there are a lot of people who still, believe that, they don't want to rock the boat, and they think, living on cushy pensions right now still is a pretty good deal. And they don't care so much about innovation and don't care so much about 50 years down the line, but really want to, not rock the boat for at least 5 to 10 years to get their pension. But
the problem is this one, indebtedness. So, like Ross said before as well, it's just that the debts are now so enormous, the government debt is going to hit big. And government debt and demographics are going to be two big issues in the 2030s. That means that we have to realize that politics itself is in decline, because politics can only implement it if it has resources. If those resources go to nothing but debt payments, government is ruined and politics is done. Yes. And I think that's what the tech guys have realized too. That's how big tech is stepping in now, and to take over and manage politics while politics itself goes into decline.
That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario would be the one you referenced before, where every politics becomes Peronism, and you just default every sort of 5 to 10 years. Well, obviously that you need the World Bank.
That's very likely. I'd like to have Benedict's point on this, because how he sees it. Because obviously America, to my view at least, America and India are much better off right now than Europe, if you make a comparison. And with Europe, everything's wrong. The focus is totally wrong. Politics is too big, too costly, and it's just preventing innovation. Nothing's happening, and demographics look terrible, and immigration is just completely, the door still open. millions are flooding in uncontrollably. That is Europe in 2024. I don't know if Benedict, if you see differently from New York, but that's my
I don't have that much to add. Actually, I agree with most of what has been said. The one thing, now this may be a bit macabre. Another reason. I mean, what you said, Alexander, about we still having a reasonably good climate for innovation, so that people come here. I mean, so that we attract more foreign talent. Of course, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Another reason is that, I mean, we've been talking about that was mentioned earlier, I think by you, Carl, about China having a window now for their nefarious shenanigans and so on. When those things happen, and I think they certainly will happen, it's something I've been talking about for 20 years, that's going to happen, then the country that's going to have the Western country that's going to bear the burden for that is the United States. It's not Europe. And that in and of itself, obviously not that anybody really wishes for that outcome, but that in and of itself is actually going to lead, I hope, to a degree of rejuvenation. And that's another reason why I have a little more hope for the United States as well. Not to say that necessarily that we would emerge victorious in such a scenario, but at least it's the country that has to fight that will find some spirit of rejuvenation in it. And that is not Europe, that is the United States. So that's another reason why I think why I agree with you, Alexander, that I think that I'm more optimistic about the United States than about Europe, certainly.
So I have two thoughts on this. First, going into Alexander's point that essentially politics will be dead because it cannot redistribute anything. It has no levers to move. Like all the cords are cut in a way. And I think the pessimistic take on this is that regardless of what administration you have, be that Trump, Vance, or whoever comes after Biden, they still will end up with the same kind of problem. And this also takes into account any kind of paradoxical connections to the technopolitical undercurrents now becoming like the new populist plus Silicon Valley power base of the MAGA movement. But the issue essentially, if you have nothing to divide, then essentially no room for reform, no room for welfare. Then the only incentive for the political actors will be to, if you can promise welfare, you'll promise revenge on enemies, real or imagined. And this would only exacerbate any kind of internal fighting we see in the US or any kind of tensions you have in Europe. And I'm not saying this in the sense that there are not real conflicts. I believe there are. But there are also actual ways by which you solve these problems. There are more efficient and less efficient ways of fighting. To go down the macabre trail here that Benedict put us on, to go down the trail of civil war, there are less and more efficient ways of fighting them. But I want to hear your thoughts on this kind of switch from whereas before you had European states and Americans geared towards warfare that then becomes welfare, and now you're in a sort of revenge territory where you essentially rile up your base, again coming back to the roots of populism, because there's nothing else to do.
I mean, I just a very quick point, I think, because now I can try to bring it back a little bit to the debates that also Alexander and Benedict at the beginning. I think what you just described very well, Johan, is of course the problem is if you want the natural progress of, I would argue in many ways, of liberalism. And I don't mean this in a derogatory fashion, but I think this has been an argument that Patrick Deneen has been making, where I think he was not entirely wrong. I think he takes it a little bit too far. The glorification of the Amish, no attack against the Amish, although it's very unlikely that they watch our podcast for obvious reasons. But that being said, right, it is of course, if you create a system, or if you put the idea that the natural condition of the human being is the individual, and that rationality, it can only or most likely be defined by whatever benefits the individual, and everything else, the kind of the Richard Dawkins argument. We just dance to the tunes of our genes, to our DNA, as he said. So everything we do is ultimately driven by our biological subconscious, and what our biology really wants is to procreate. Although I would argue that basically the entire Richard Dawkins argument breaks down if you look at birth rates, because apparently we're the only species who can educate itself out of procreation, which is at the same time devastating And at the other hand, shows you kind of the almost limitlessness of the human spirit, right? We're the only species who can create cultural conditions that make it harder and harder and harder for us to actually continue our own existence. I mean, and that's really fascinating. But I think the problem is, of course, that modern governments are stuck in this. Because even conservative parties, even right-wing parties, left-wing parties, and center parties, I think none of them dares, and I understand why, to come out and say, we actually need a massive reduction of the state. That at the end of the day, people must live their lives on their own. That the idea that somebody takes care of you at old age, well, to some extent, that should be your family, or you and your family making provisions. Or you and the family planning for this, not just leaning back and saying, oh, the state is going to do it for me anyways. So the state is supposed to be there for education. The state is going to be there for healthcare. The state is going to be there for retirement. And my most favorite thing, this was already a couple of years ago, I think a British court decided that for a British man who had some psychological issue, the British government even had to pay for his prostitutes. So, right, I mean, it basically everything is going to be covered by the government at the state. What's the point of having community, or what's the point of finding community after all? Now, on a more positive note, I think that as we move into the society we described a couple of minutes ago, where everybody is older and older and older and older, that the value of kids and family is increasing. So I think there will be a move back. I saw just a little bit observed that you see more and more celebrities, particularly women, who take pictures of themselves in the late stages of their pregnancy, but depicted in very positive ways. So I think that this attitude is shifting. But of course, it's very difficult to reverse demographic decline. Right? What you're going to do if everybody's 45 years old and says, oh my God, I really would like to have children. Yeah, unfortunately, your biological clock ran out, so you can't really do it. But I think this is shifting, but it is also a consequence of this. And by the way, I think this attitude, this is the big irony. The most successful in many ways export of Western civilization was this specific characteristic of liberalism, because that's also what the Indians are fighting with, what the Chinese fighting with, what pretty much everybody except Sub-Saharan Africa is fighting with. And you could make, of course, it's economic and technology as well, but you could make the argument, if I can be provocative for a second, that there seems to be somewhat of a not a causation, but a correlation of the less penetrated you are by Western civilization, the higher your birth rates are. But we simply say in the West, if countries develop and progress, then birth rates tend to go down. But of course, subconsciously, when we say progress in the West, what we mean is Westernization. And I think kind of if we're honest about this, if we say that Westernization leads to lower birth rates, I don't think that's entirely wrong.
I think it is wrong. I think it's urbanization that leads to lower birth rates, because the birth rates in Korea and Japan are even lower than in Europe. So and they're lowering everywhere right now. As soon as you urbanize, even in Africa, as soon as you urbanize, the birth rates fall dramatically. And we have the pill and the condom attitude in the 20th century, and the dramatic innovations that changed everything forever. Now, I think this is the case with Europe, to be honest about it. I don't think we'd have any hopes out there for somebody like Farage to change the game. I think what's going to happen is that some people listen to guys like Ralph, and they'll understand how serious the situation is, and they'll get married, and they try to stay monogamous, and they'll really fight to make it work. And they'll live in communities with other people to do that. I know some of these libertarian communities now in Europe, they're walking out of politics, isolating themselves, buying property in the countryside, which is nobody can see what they're doing, and they're building families, right? So that's already happening. It's probably going to have some kind of religious connotations, easier to do if you have a religious community. But that's a minority. The vast majority of Europeans will just go older and older, and they will refuse to hear the bad news out there, and they'll be living with indebted governments, and finally they will not have any money coming from the pension funds. And that's got to be over the last 30 years in Europe. Europe right now is like Egypt at the end of the Bronze Age. It's just falling apart. And it doesn't help about Muslims integrating in huge amounts. We can just hope that these Muslims choose to be urbanized and choose to be secularized. Because right now we don't know. So that's the game for Europe right now. That's what we're up against, I'd say.
We covered both the US and the European particularities of populism. Is there a facet we have missed out on? Maybe I want to get back on Benedict's rejuvenation point.
Let's do a last hurrah, because I think we're coming up against it pretty soon here. I think
Okay, so
let's start with Benedict and rejuvenation. That's the perfect last round. So.
Yeah. Well, so the reason, I mean, I can now take a slightly broader view. I mean, this is something I've written about a lot as well, but the reason this rejuvenation capacity still exists in the United States is because we're still historical, so to speak. And I'm using a certain, the language of the philosophy of history here. But as I said before, I mean, when global conflagrations occur, we're the ones to fight them here in the United States, and that is a rejuvenating force. And I mean, obviously, decline is not a straight. Just like ascent is a zigzag pattern, so decline is a zigzag pattern, and it's not a straight line that brings us toward decline. So I think here, for us at least, there is the possibility that we will experience. We're certainly overall in a declining phase. There's no question about that. But that we will continue to experience certain upsurges in that pattern. I think still, and it's because we still carry to a considerable extent. I mean, now less and less, but still to a considerable extent, we carry the burden of the world order on our shoulders, and the necessities of that create circumstances. Just to elaborate slightly more on the point I made, create circumstances under which people in which there can be a rejuvenation of culture and a renewed pride in one's heritage, a renewed oikophilia, and so on. Certainly because. We still have certain enemies against which to measure ourselves, which Europe does not, at least not in the same way, and that can certainly help. And now the difference in living standards that can occur as a result of such conflagrations is one that we can also feel to a considerable extent, because again, not necessarily living standards, but in the sense that when people die overseas, for example, that has an effect on a culture. And that is something that is still experienced to some extent here in the United States. Obviously, Israel is the extreme Western example of that. But we still have it to some extent here in the United States as well, whereas Western Europe does not. And so those are all reasons that I think still contribute to rejuvenation and to certain upsurges in that zigzag pattern of decline.
So I think the reason why I think your point of rejuvenation is interesting, but because it comes back to Ralph's comment of, I mean, take someone like Trump. He's clearly not a conservative. If anything, he would be described as the reason why you like him is because he probably is more fun to have a party with than his opponents. And I think this comes back to Alexander's point of like the breakdown of politics, that it doesn't matter anymore if it's progressive or conservative. It's more about who has the best Lebensphilosophy. Like, what does a good life look like, or exciting life, or a smart life? And while I can understand, we can take this tangentially all the way into sort of vitalism, where, of course, you have someone like the Bronze Age pervert being an influence on Vance. But there is that level of when there are no more politics, then eventually whoever can offer a better life is a viable candidate. And in that sense, Trump is a better candidate because he's more vital than Biden is vital. So I think what's interesting with
it goes without saying, though, doesn't it?
I'm trying to make this family friendly, Carl. You know, a broad audience. But the point also here is that back to rejuvenation and its connection to populism is that one way by which an incumbent, if you say deep state proponent, as opposed to these kind of dropout entrepreneurs, would be to out-vitalize these vitalist populists. So, for instance, if you would want to defeat the Trump-Vance ticket at this point, basically you would find a reason to start a conflagrating war with some major geopolitical opponent, forcing everyone to back up the current president, and then rush into that breach, essentially. That is, you try to make more of a rejuvenation ticket than what you're challenged by. It's in that stage when a society either risks disintegration or coming together, where these kind of politics become, if not just viable, then necessary, perhaps. So I wonder if the rejuvenation aspect here it's while I see it as a promise in a way that conflict can bring something constructive to it, it also means that it's not just that these things will clear out in a few years that Alexander was after, but also that the road to things becoming clearer eventually, will be perhaps even more conflictual than anything we've seen in quite some time, because we are aging, because we don't have any reform space, because we don't have vitalism. Then rejuvenation becomes the only political remedy.
So what you're saying is we should march on Copenhagen.
Well, I would just add that the rejuvenation in Western Europe, I mean, for us here in the United States, the role of the adversary in rejuvenation is external. In Western Europe, the role of the adversary in rejuvenation is internal.
We do what we do best, which is just...
Because I mean that's why you see Rassemblement National in France, for example, gaining more votes with every election, just for that reason.
Yeah.
Whether that will ultimately be enough to turn back the tide of Islamization and so on is another question. But at least in terms of the source of potential rejuvenation, I think that's an important distinction to make as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to make a finer point on it, I mean, just having a political party named Reconquête is I mean, the ultimate, sort of pointer to this, that what we're talking about is, European history and American history is very, very different. I mean, America is very ideas-based. We are very based. European countries are based on this sort of the problem, and the positive and the negative, because my fear is the fact that the European Union sort of bureaucracy is actually trying to do the sort of geopolitical smart thing is actually the worst thing for Europe, because we've always thrived in a sort of inter-nation sort of competitive stance between all the nations of Europe. And it's all the only time has been dynamic where we haven't been ruled by a monolith, and hence the sort of oppressive post-Cold War climate we're still living in is sort of the downfall, and we can't break out of the murk because of it. It's my fear, and maybe like a collapse of the European project because of AfD victory or Le Pen or whomever is the sort of thing we need, ironically.
I don't know, but I think there are two different ways of doing rejuvenation. One of them is to bring the young guys on board, and that's what Elon Musk is doing, for example. That's rejuvenation, but it's very limited. So the problem is that the vast majority of voters out there, especially old senior citizens who want their pensions, they don't see that they get a part of the cake if that happens. So they don't get anything from Musk. So they will then go for somebody who rejuvenates the entire society, or otherwise they don't care.
Yep. So
if the first type of rejuvenation does not happen, which is the case in Europe right now, it's happening in India, it's happening in America, it's even happening in China. You have the Jack Ma's of the world, you have these entrepreneurs, Elon Musk's of the world, and they do rejuvenation, and they can look up to, and they're the American dream or the Indian dream, whatever you want to call it. There is no such dream in Europe at all any longer. And if you can't even have that microscopic form of rejuvenation, which Macron tried, why Macron didn't work was that he mistook one for the other. So he looked like an entrepreneur, tech entrepreneur, trying to be president of France. When, of course, 90% of French people just thought he was arrogant, and like they would have if they had Elon Musk as a president of America. No, he's just arrogant, self-obsessed. He takes $48 billion in cash, for paid whatever. So, they hate him. They hated Macron because Macron tried to be tech entrepreneur, was president of France, and that won't work. Because the rejuvenation, which is so deep, the Benedicts talk about, is to go to war. And there's a reason why Israel breeds, right? And Palestine breeds too. This idea of go to war, not the cynical type of war you got in Ukraine and Russia, with two different oligarchies fighting each out against each other, and nobody really cares. But either way, you go to war about something people actually do believe in, with a flag that actually they do respect. Well, that's what Europe is so far from that now, that I think we're beyond the point that we can't even imagine something like that. We can just hope for having a few companies that give a few jobs to Europeans, and then hope the Muslims go secular as quickly as possible. Give them drugs or whatever and hope they go secular. That's your best hope of the next 30 years. I don't see anything else.
So the populist paraphrase of the Spartan mom is return with this meme or upon it.
I think France will let Le Pen win, and then they will let Mélenchon win the next time, and they go back and forth. And I mean, these are the populists we're stuck with. We're not stuck with the smart populists. We're stuck with those who are smart enough to win the elections and spend money they don't have, and then 4 years later pass it on to somebody else and pretend nothing happened. That's what I think is going to happen, to be honest about it. But that's because liberal democracy itself spent like crazy. Biden has spent more money than America ever did at war. Money he didn't have. On what? Green stuff, climate stuff, whatever. It didn't work. It would look so terrible when you look back at the 2020s, when you look at history, that how the fuck could anybody spend that type of money when they were at peace and not at war and having those huge government deficits? And that's exactly why these communities I'm talking about and listen to Rolf, who build families and try to get some kind of religion, are all Bitcoiners. Because right now, Bitcoin looks like the only thing you can trust because none of these fucking central banks and none of these politicians can corrupt it. And that's exactly why it's getting so popular. And that's why it's such a strong underground movement right now happening, especially in Europe. That's my best hope. The Bitcoin communities are my best hope right now for the future. They're the new civil society.
The huge irony here is also the sort of climate war where we're in with ourselves, spending billions and billions of euros and dollars on the climate. Sort of ironically, spending it on war would be a better driver for innovation, or historically has been.
For rejuvenation.
Which is, I mean, obviously a point Ralph has made a couple of thousand times himself. But I think so. This is the problem, right? We're spending even like the monstrous government spending. You know, people slag off going to the moon. I mean, half of the materials in our kitchens right now are made from and the computers and whatnot. I mean, it's all from the sort of the power race or the power competition in the 20th century, and now everything is just decadent. Everything is just sacrificing people on pyramids to appease the sun god, basically, waiting for the apocalypse. Well, on that happy note, gentlemen.
Ralph, wait. I want Ralph in before you close. Please, Carl.
A quick last one. No, I think all the points you made, I find myself full agreement. The optimism I have is that every society, once you move, it doesn't matter which direction, too far out to the fringes, there is a regression to the mean at some point. I think the big problem is going to be when the Americans come to their senses, when the Indians come to their senses, when the Japanese come to their senses, and they kind of regress back to sanity, they still have a country. I think the problem that we have in Europe is that we already have a successor population in place. And as much as I would love to see Alexander's vision being fulfilled, I just think that the Islamization of Europe is more likely than the Europeization of Islam, at least in Western Europe, right? I think Poland, Hungary, Croatia, Slovakia, they probably won't have the problem. But it's at the end, it's a demography game. I can just give you the numbers for Vienna by 2050. Over 50% of every Viennese under 15 will be a Muslim. So the idea that some of them will liberalize, I have no doubt about this, right? Some of them will sign up to Western liberalism. But my fear is that you probably get the worst combination of these things. You get kind of the license of liberalism and the fanaticism of Islam. So that's my biggest worry. So once sanity comes back in, it might be too late in some parts of the world. And this is to go back to what Carl said at the very beginning, right? Ultimately, that was the problem of the Romans. I'm sure that 400 AD, they said, wait a moment, maybe we should return to traditional Roman values. But they have been, on the long run, luckily for us, but at the moment, probably not at the moment for them at the time, they've been overrun by Christianity and non-Romans. And so there were not enough Romans left to rejuvenate the Romans. The Chinese had plenty of overthrows and upheavals in their history, but ultimately they were always Chinese. So you can survive many catastrophes in your history, but I think you can't survive demographic replacement, for better or worse, right? I mean, maybe the world is a better place without the Romans, but maybe the world would be a better place without the Europeans. But I think this is going to be the problem.
Okay, gentlemen, exciting times ahead.
Like, seriously, if Joe Biden isn't on the ticket because of mental health or health reasons, how can he still rule the country? Like, technically, how isn't the argument for him being, 25th Amendmented?
No, but that might happen. But I mean, that's why he, it's one of the reasons he chose Kamala Harris, because he knows, well, surely nobody's going to prefer her to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the perfect end note for this conversation. You just nailed it.
Just a very quick end note. Johan, I'll see you in 2 weeks, I think.
Yes.
We'll be on the stage. And Benedict, I think I see you in the fall in Budapest. they didn't even inform me about this, that I will be moderate either a talk by you or a panel with you on it.
With me in it?
Yes.
It's interesting that I have not been informed that I will be giving. That I will
wait.
Oh, good. I gotta write this down. What am I talking about? What's the subject of my lecture?
Dear Ralph, I hope everything is good for you.
I'm turning off the recording. This is turning Central European.